Welcome to this lesson, Waterfall or Agile, what to choose. A tough one. Now, I know there's many variations to how each of these approaches can be delivered, but this is for you if you are just trying to understand the differences between the two and then allow you to make your decisions on the best way of working to take forward for your project. So, what is Waterfall and Agile? So, the Waterfall methodology or model was a traditional approach to project management, or is, I should say. And it breaks down the stages of a project into sequential phases, like you can see to the right there. And I'll explain this a little bit more detail with an example shortly. Now, this goes back as far as the 1950s, but the actual term waterfall wasn't used until the 70s. So, considering waterfall is still very popular today, it's still pretty amazing that we are working in the same way that was happening back in the 1950s, a long, long time ago. And then the Agile model is an iterative approach for creating products, services, can be absolutely anything, by releasing small increments of work that allow for fast feedback as you build your product. And Agile practices were first used in the 90s, but this wasn't until early 2001 when the Agile Manifesto was created. And I'm not covering that today, but you can just Google that to see more detail on that. And it really took off with frameworks like Scrum, just getting more and more popular. And then I'm sure you've probably heard of Scrum today. If you haven't, quick Google and it's everywhere. It's very, very popular. Right, let's just go down into a bit more detail on the waterfall approach first. So as I said, it's sequential. So I'm going to give you an example of building out a website to explain what this means. So the first thing is you've got the requirements. So if you're going to build a website, you've got to document everything you need that website to do. The functional requirements, architecture documents, business rules, everything that's just going to describe how it's going to work so the team can then actually go and build it. And then once you've done that, you would then move on to the user experience. So, okay, we understand the requirements for this website, like all the features and things like that, and the detail within them. How are they all going to connect together in what's called a user flow, which is like step-by-step user experience? And then how are those website pages going to look like? And that's the wireframes. So setting out into different sections on a page. Where's the top hero bar going to be? Where's the login button going to be, etc., etc. And then once that user experience team have designed the whole website with the wireframes and those user flows, it's then passed on to the visual design team. And then they're the team who are going to create the look and feel. So at its simplest, putting some color on those wireframes. There's obviously a lot more to it than that. But so by this point, on paper, ultimately it's going to be in a digital tool, something like that. You'll be able to look at what all the different pages look like in your website that you now need to build, which is the next stage, development. So then you've got the engineers or the developers who take those designs, take those requirements, and then they'll build the website based on all of that. And obviously, this might be a few weeks, might be a few months, might be a year, who knows? And once they're finished, so we've done that, they pass it on to the testing team or quality assurance, or you might have heard it be called, or the team you work on at QAs. And they take all of that work those developers have done, and this is normally in an environment that's, well, it would be in an environment that's not live to the customers, and they start going through that website and they're comparing it to what were in those original requirements and checking to see if those requirements have been met or not. And then once they've done that phase, quite common to then pass over to the client. So certainly if you're in the agency world, or this could be stakeholders if you're within a company, and the client will then go back through because they have approved these requirements at the start and have a look at what have we done? Does it meet our requirements? and often this is called user acceptance testing, UAT. Basically, just to verify, has everything been built that we'd asked the team to build it? All sounds very straightforward. Just follow these simple steps and you've got a website at the end. But we all know it doesn't work exactly like that. But that's essentially how Waterfall works. And you can replace what I've put in there with all sorts of other different products and services. So some of the advantages, and I'll say this, yes, there are advantages, but you'll see as I start to describe these, you might start to understand maybe these aren't quite so good. But let me begin. I'll let you make your mind up. You can define what's needed up front. So everybody's aligned on what's required, when you're going to get it done by, and how much it's going to cost. So as a project manager, fantastic. We've got everything in place, we've got this ideal, perfect plan. Everyone's happy. Everyone has confidence. And then each team, they can pretty much build the product in silos. So that visual design team, those developers, because everything's agreed up front. And as all the development, so the build, so those engineers is completed in one stage, within that development team, multiple aspects of development have to happen in parallel. So you've got all of the maybe back-end engineers, front-end engineers, anything that's needed, API developers, all working together. Very, very clear if you're a stakeholder or a project manager or a team member, anyone who's involved, what stage you're at and what the project or who the project is currently with from a team perspective. So, again, in theory, this makes planning your team's time much more manageable and easier, as well as be able to budget each stage as well. You can spend a lot of time designing the complete project or product because at the start, that requirement stage, you have to understand everything. So it takes a lot of time. If you want to understand everything, you need time. But the disadvantages are what you define as the requirements in the first stage might not reach the customer's hands until the final UAT stage. So, all the way from the requirements, the stakeholders have agreed this is what we want, all the way through to that UAT testing phase. And what I didn't say on those requirements, those sequential stages at the start is then the product goes live. Because by this point, it might not be what the customer needs or want. You might have taken 7 months to build that website and they've moved on to another competitor by now because they're fed up with how crappy your current website is. Or the industry's changed significantly. There's been a real disruptor, and now you're way behind. So it really can put you at a disadvantage. And as each stage is sequential, the handing over of information at each stage, so requirements to design, design to develop, develop to QA, etc., involves high effort and is open for mistakes, misunderstandings, assumptions, etc., especially when it comes to the written word. If someone's reading requirements, one person may read it in one way, another person in another way. It doesn't matter how much time and effort you spend on detailing those requirements, there will be misunderstandings. It doesn't create a one team approach. Like I mentioned about that one team in the development stage working together, that's just different skills all within the same team. But if you've got a team doing one piece of work and then they completely finish and hand over to another, then there's just no collaboration there. It's just essentially just throwing the product over the fence to the next team, and that can cause issues, especially when it goes from development into testing, because testing will say it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that, it says this in the requirements, and the developers will say, well, it does do that because it's doing this. And like, no, that means this. And you're like, and it just becomes chaos. And although the requirements phase is detailed, you just cannot think of everything. And new requirements will come up in the later stages. And this impacts time, budgets, and you've got lots of change requests as you go through the project. And the agile approach. I'm going to do the same now. We'll a bit more detail about what it is, advantages, disadvantages, and then we can start to summarize at the end. And then obviously you can make up your own decision. Iterative and agility. So an agile methodology or framework is an approach to build a product or service iteratively. Doesn't have to be software. It can be used for absolutely anything. Because it was initially designed for software development because software development was just getting too complex. So that waterfall approach just didn't work because there was just too many changes. The team just couldn't understand everything up front. And an agile approach defines the requirements, designs the product, builds and tests concurrently. Well, almost, but certainly not separated into really siloed sequential stages like the waterfall approach. And the teams continually work together, building the product service, gathering feedback from customers early and throughout. So it's a set of repeating cycles like you can see on the right there. And you might not be building something, but again, this is a software example, but it could be absolutely anything. Now, the advantages of an agile approach is you build the product iteratively, which allows the team to create the product piece by piece rather than trying to design everything up front and trying to answer all of the questions on how to do it, which is very, very hard to do. And well, it's impossible to do, certainly on a complex project. And you work on what is the highest value item for your client or your user at that point in time. So rather than being bound to those requirements at the start, you can go, right now, oh, something's changed in the industry. We need to get our website to do this right now. And you can do that with a more agile way of working. You can put the product into the customer's hands early. So whoever your customer is, and that might be internal, it might be someone in the public, could be anyone, just by getting the people who are going to use your product using it, you very, very quickly find out things that you completely missed or you thought was valuable, but actually isn't. And you typically work in time box iterations within frameworks like Scrum, where you demo the work completed with your client or customers in a week or 2 week increments. And what that does is allows for lots of transparency, so it creates a continuous feedback loop. And it really does help with a one team approach because you've got all different skill sets, designers, engineers, again, using the website example, creating the product together. And because you're not bound by a set of predefined set of requirements, which means there's no change requests or time extensions and things like that, you're working together on what's the most important thing to do. The disadvantages. So most companies still work with a waterfall approach in some form. So they struggle to adapt to this more iterative build process versus just, I want to know everything. I must know all the requirements, exactly how long this is going to take, and exactly when I'm going to get what I'm asking for. And there's a misconception that there isn't much planning with an agile approach, which actually isn't the case. I would say there's actually more planning when you're working in an agile way of working versus waterfall. And the problem is that reduces the confidence in the clients or the stakeholders that you work with because they want to know exactly what they're going to get ahead of time. And you need to spend, or the client needs to spend a high amount of time with the team on the project throughout for this approach to work well. Now, depending on the context and the setup, this can mean quite a few different things. But ultimately, the people who could be making decisions regularly about what this product and service does need to have high involvement. Not everybody does, but certain people do. And if the team are not co-located, then close collaboration is difficult, and this can impact productivity and team morale. Now, this is less of a problem these days because remote working is far more common, but collaboration, working face to face on a product where you're iteratively building, it's definitely easier when you're doing that together. But there's some downsides to obviously being in the office as well. And an agile approach requires far higher empowerment of the team versus a waterfall project, because otherwise it can impact productivity and team morale. And by this, I mean, because you're iteratively building out the product, you've got to be making the decisions on what's the best approach, how should we build this, what's the good customer experience, right, we should do it this way, we should do it that way. Lots of conversation, which is really, really good, versus waterfall, you're just following a plan, which is essentially those requirements at the start. So people don't have to think as much. When people don't think, there's typically more problems and you won't get as good a product at the end of the day. So, how to choose? It's not easy. Um, Here's a few things to think about. You put them side by side. So, the agile approach from the team setup, typically they have all of the capabilities to build that product iteratively versus waterfall. You've got lots of independent teams owning each stages of the requirements through to UAT before it ultimately goes live. User testing. So nothing beats getting your product, whatever it is, in the customer's hands. So working with customers throughout to test and learn on the agile approach versus the waterfall can be very limited until the product is live, and potentially none at all until it goes live. Stakeholders, you can have continuous involvement, and I don't mean every single day, but a high amount of time is needed with them to work with the team. Versus the waterfall approach, much higher involvement during the stage, and then during the requirements phase, and then they'll step back more and come and see things how progressing at the end of each stage. Then from a planning perspective, planning on an agile approach is completed in short increments and revised regularly to work on the highest priority items. Versus waterfall, planning is long and detailed in the requirements phase, but then you're just following the plan after that. So there's less change in theory. And then scope from an agile approach. Scope can be planned at a high level at the start, but then it's continually adjusted throughout depending on the priority. Versus waterfall, it's fixed at the start for the duration of the projects, and any other changes are handled through change requests. And then on your budgets, the budget on an agile approach can still be fixed at the start to an agree on a team size and duration, or you could pay for a team cost per sprint or iteration. So it doesn't just keep going and going and going. You still have limits, but a waterfall approach is set at the start and it's fixed for the duration of the complete project. Now that's it. What do you think? Agile or waterfall? Or more likely, something in the middle is much more common, a more hybrid approach. Now, waterfall can work when things are very simple, but as soon as things get complex, if your project is months and months and months long, there's no way that you can plan out a project for that long and it's going to go exactly to plan. It never does. So as soon as things get a little bit complex, a little bit of unknown, you haven't done something before, that is when you need a more agile approach to things because you just need that flexibility to pivot and change when things take longer or you discover something new. So, yes, I hope that's helpful. Think about your approach, think about the things that you need to consider for your approach for how you deliver your products and services, no matter what you do. All right, thank you very much.